Can you tell me what happened?
I woke up and I heard it. It was screaming.
Welcome back, ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in Alien Earth Episode 4. Now, before we get into this episode, I want to mention some of the things that we did miss in our last breakdown, and we're very sorry about that. When the specimens are being loaded into Prodigy's lab, the forklift we see carrying them features the same hydraulic claws as the P-5000. That's the giant mech suit that Ripley used to kill the Queen in James Cameron's Aliens. And, speaking of aliens, the suit that Adam wears has these signature bladed collars, just like the one that Carter Burke wore in Aliens. Now, the movie that Slightly was watching when Morrow first contacted him was Disney's 2013 epic Frozen, which helps continue Holly's tradition of making somewhat modern movies feel nostalgic in this pessimistic future. Now, there's more details that we missed, but luckily we are going to get a chance to talk about them later, so let's dive into everything that we found in episode 4. Now, this episode is all about control and recognizing one's place. It's about observing the world as it is rather than what we want it to be. Hence, the title of the episode, Observation, and the opening certainly sets that tone. The opening changes things up a bit. Instead of focusing on a xenomorph body, we get this shot of a doll head washed along the shore. Now, it's fitting not only because this is the first episode without a fully grown xenomorph drone in it, but it's also an apt metaphor for the loss of childhood innocence that we see in this episode. Now, while it once had a life of its own through some child's imagination, just like the hybrids, now it's simply trash on the beach and presents a metaphorical view of how Prodigy sees them as expendable products rather than people, a revelation that many of the characters come to throughout this episode. We also see frames of the previous episode spliced in, recapping the events, including this shot of Joe being scanned by a bioscanner, which, by the way, we did forget to mention in our last breakdown. This scene is straight out of Prometheus when Shaw first finds out that she's infected. Then we catch up with Wendy, who wakes up silently since Prodigy turned off her hearing. And you've got to love how Sidney Chandler shows this by trying to pop her ears like she's on an airplane. Now, when Boy Cavalier walks in, he says,
"I have a colonic in 30 minutes.
Which is a fancy term for a butt douche and coincidentally exactly the kind of person that Cavalier is.
Got him!
Boy also seems pretty confrontational with Kirsch, belittling him and constantly trying to put him in his place, almost as if he feels somewhat threatened by Kirsch. Now, this makes sense given that Kirsch has all the advantages of the hybrids, but without the limitations or vulnerabilities that the hybrids have with their underdeveloped brains. If there's anyone who could challenge Boy both physically and mentally, it's him. What makes Alien stand out from a lot of other sci-fi franchises is the details that they put into this future. Like, this is a time period when corporations literally ruled the world, and they use their wealth to control how people think. In every movie, we see Weyland-Yutani using secrecy and misinformation to place ordinary people in danger. And let's face it, we also live in an age of misinformation, where we never know what kind of corporate propaganda is driving and paying for the news that we consume. The internet has been flooded with fake news, and you just don't know who to trust. Most mainstream media sites have what's called a profit bias, so the news that you get to see is curated by a corporation that just wants to get you engaged and angry enough to confirm your existing bias so you'll stick around and watch their ads. And that's why, if you want to cut through the bias and hear the real news, I recommend Ground News. They're the sponsor of this video. Ground News is an app and website that gathers related articles from across the world into one place. But they give you the context about the source's political leaning, their reliability, and most importantly, their ownership. This means that you can see through the bias and think critically about the news you consume. For instance, here's a story that I saw about Trump supporter Peter Navarro recommending the president for the Nobel Prize in Economics. You can see sources on the right, including phrases like deserves the Nobel Prize, while sources on the left called Navarro a sycophant, a hack, and called Trump the Taco King. I can see how many sources reported on this story, how many of them lean left or right, and like I said, most importantly, who owns those news sources. That way, I know who has an angle in telling the story a certain way. And I also want to know that the news isn't trying to sway me one way or the other. So Ground News even has a blind spot section that shows you news stories that both sides are ignoring. Here's a story that only got one report from the right about Georgia elections being illegally influenced by a super PAC that turned out to be a Ponzi scheme. Or there's this story about Nancy Pelosi proposing a ban on politicians trading stocks that got way more attention from right-wing outlets because Nancy Pelosi trades a lot of stocks. Using this feature helps to give me a better rounded view of all the news and not just the news that supports my existing bias. Ground News is an incredible resource, and I've been looking for a service like this for years, so I highly encourage you to check them out. If you go go to ground.news/SC or click this QR code, you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to every feature. Your subscription will not only help out this channel, but you'll also be supporting an independent platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. Now, as we said earlier, this episode exposes how Prodigy truly sees the hybrids and whether or not they really believe in the idea that they're trying to sell. And we get our first taste of that when he dismisses Dr. Sylvia as well, saying,
"Careful, you're not a mother. It's an IT issue, not a gap session."
Boy makes it very clear that she is a thing, a product, an asset, and we can see that sense of entitlement isn't exclusive to the hybrids and the synthetics either. We see him flex this same power over his human employees, just like he does with Joe as soon as he walks in. The fact that Boy sees both of his living employees and synthetics as property rather than people shows how this future society values capital above all else, which has been a core tenet of this franchise ever since the first movie. Wendy is asked to describe the sound. She says it's
Like bugs rubbing their legs together.
which all but confirms our theory from episode 1 that the xenomorphs communicate through seismic communication.
Oh yeah, I remember that, but for everybody else, just run through it again.
So seismic or vibrational communication is a process of conveying information through vibrations, which is commonly seen in insects. They produce the sounds in a number of ways, but one of the most common is stridulation, which specifically involves rubbing two parts of their body together, like grasshoppers. Now, we know that xenos clearly aren't strumming their legs together, specifically when we've heard the sound in the show, but there are other ways that animals produce seismic sounds in the wild. Some insects even have specific organs that can vibrate, or by using specific frequencies only they can detect. For example, elephants communicate with each other over a 20-mile radius by using ground vibrations that are well below the range that humans and almost all other animals can hear.
But I don't get it. If it's too quiet for people, then how do elephants talk to each other from so far away?
Well, that's because we're not talking about the volume, Doug. We're talking about the frequency. You see, sound travels in waves. The volume is the intensity of the wave, or its power, and is typically measured in decibels. Frequency, however, measures how many waves are hitting you at a given time, or how frequent they are, and they're measured in hertz. Some frequencies are beyond human hearing, which is typically between 20 and 16,000 hertz. Anything above or below that is impossible for us to detect. The sound that elephants make to communicate are too low for us to hear because they're below 20 hertz. There are also frequencies that are too high for humans to detect, like dog whistles, which are around 23,000 and 54,000 hertz. And as we see during the test, Wendy starts hearing the xenos around 20,000 hertz, which is already at the peak frequency that humans can hear. And real quick, I want to show you guys these two new fun shirts at our merch store. We have two different xenomorphs, one with sunglasses looking cool bursting out of your chest, and the other one with a little top hat and cane, you know, like this. Shopping our merch store is the best way to directly support our channel, and get this, you can now become a member and get free stuff. Links for everything are below. We then see Arthur slowly increase his sensitivity to around 75,000 hertz, which is a range that we know she can comfortably hear since we saw her do so in the first episode when they were testing her hearing.
She's beyond our human frequencies, 75,000 hertz.
Boy then asks her to make the sound, convincing her to do so by saying,
Asimov said above a certain level, technology is indistinguishable from magic.
which is a line that we've heard before in the MCU, specifically in the first Thor movie.
Your ancestors called it magic, and you call it science. Well, I come from a place where they're one and the same thing.
This comes from Arthur C. Clarke's 3 Laws, which appeared in Clarke's essay, Hazards of Prophecy, The Failure of Imagination. They're essentially the 3 truths that he concluded after years of writing sci-fi. The other laws are, when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong, which clearly values the insight of the youth, just like our man-child CEO. The final law reads, the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible, which is of course exactly what Prodigy is doing by trying to achieve artificial immortality. We then see Wendy herself venture past what she thinks is possible when she's able to recreate the xeno sounds fully at a frequency level audible for humans. And everybody instantly hates it. Even Boy jumps back a bit before using it to tease Curly, saying,
Sure, you speak French, but can you do that?
Which just goes to show how big a mistake she made by trusting Boy with her aspirations. He clearly knows that she's seeking his validation and without hesitation immediately uses that to control her and diminish her value. Joe suggests that she takes a break when Boy says,
She has a lithium-ion battery that could power a small city. She doesn't need to rest.
further reiterating how he sees her as property and not a human being with full autonomy, which is ironically what Wendy ends up lashing out at Joe for. This is when Joe and Wendy decide to venture to her room while Boy and Adam discuss the implications of their discovery. Boy is clearly aware of the Xeno's potential as a bioweapon, and he knows that giving Yutani the specimens back will likely end up with him becoming Xenobait. It also seems that Boy feels threatened by Joe, but not necessarily in the same way that he's threatened by Kirsch. Not only does he clearly have a thing against family members, as we see later, but he clearly resents how close Joe is to Wendy and his potential to compromise what he sees as his greatest asset, which is why he exits with,
Tell the brother he can stay, but he's working for us.
The conflict?
No, just a reminder. It's my world. He just lives in it.
As childish as he is, he certainly knows the extent of the power he holds. He feels just as entitled to do whatever he wants with Joe's life just because he employs him, and he chooses to use that to reiterate who is in control.
It's a metaphor for capitalism, Morty. What do you think?
Back in Wendy's room, we start to see the siblings open up about their complicated family history. It seems as if Wendy wasn't allowed to have photos of Joe, given that the only picture we see of him is a drawing, which looks, by the way, remarkably realistic due to her synthetically enhanced drawing abilities. Now, when she asks if Joe is mad at her, not only for speaking to the xenomorphs, but also
Because you had to go to a cemetery. For me.
he corrects her, explaining how his frustration is toward the system rather than her personally. He is well aware of how little power he holds in this late-stage capitalistic nightmare, but Wendy was too young to understand how the world really works before she transitioned. Now, the fact that he didn't visit her in the hospital clearly bothers her, even if those emotions are completely artificial. And although she takes him at his word, we know that this conversation isn't necessarily exclusive, since Prodigy is watching everything, and we see Boy attempt to weaponize these feelings against her later in the episode. The two watched Ice Age 4, which, as we said last week, was included because it was director Noah Hawley's son's favorite movie to watch, and he always chose it every time Hawley asked him what movie he wanted to see. It's certainly a more intimate reference, but it's a fitting reminder of the closeness that we feel from family, and the comfort we get from family. But as we transition to Boy reading a passage from Peter Pan, it also shows us how vulnerable media leaves us. The passage he reads details how Neverland has no nightlights, and as it transitions from a fantasy to a reality, not only do the dreams become real, but the nightmares become real as well. The scenes give a heavy predator-prey vibe, not only through the visual of the spider catching its prey, but this is also where we see Slightly venture out into the thick of the jungle to talk to Morrow, which is a reference to the first Predator movie itself, since it took place in a similar setting. The theme segues perfectly into the conversation between Slightly and Morrow as we see Morrow's attempt to groom Slightly. He uses explicitly manipulative childlike language, especially after Slightly accuses him of lying, where he responds with,
Well, I didn't know if you were a villain or a hero.
His use of the word hero here is like how he used the word monsters during their first encounter. He chooses to use words that appeal to their immaturity. He chooses words that he knows children are capable of understanding at a conceptual level, making it easier to access and manipulate their artificial emotions. He specifically uses the word hero here to convince Slightly that stealing the ovomorph is morally just, going as far as saying,
Think of it as restitution.
Just like the last time we saw them interact, this scene heavily plays off the ideas of the early AOL chat rooms in the 90s, or even modern games like Roblox, which have become a breeding ground for online predators. These predators will often attempt to befriend children online to gain their trust before convincing them to reveal critical identifying information, and Morrow uses a similar tactic to get Slightly's real name, which we know that he later uses to find his family. Now, when we get to his room, we can see cricket equipment on the wall. Now, cricket is not only a popular sport in the UK, but also in Slightly's home country of India. It's also, not for nothing, the most boring sport in the world. Sure, the ball is hard to hit, but how does a sport go on for days and end with a tie? If you're a fan of cricket, please explain it to me in the comments, because I cannot wrap my mind around this particular branch of sports ball.
Sports.
Now, in our last breakdown, we talked about how the show is positioning Kirsch as a mirror of Morrow, and we also see that again here, but it's a bit more complicated than we thought. Throughout Slightly and Morrow's conversation, we see shots of Kirsch watching everything unfold through Slightly's eyes, but instead of reporting it to the higher-ups, he decides to confront Slightly in his room instead, where Kirsch ominously educates him on the three wise monkeys.
Mizaru sees no evil, Kikazaru hears no evil, Iwazaru speaks no evil.
Now we see these statues above the beds of all the Lost Boys, and as we discussed in our episode 2 breakdown, they're meant to remind not only the hybrids, but all of Prodigy employees of how to cope with the moral complexities of their employment. Some remain blind, ignorantly buying into Prodigy's narrative. Like Dame Sylvia or the children themselves, they pretend not to notice to avoid the responsibility they have in Prodigy's crimes, just like Mazzio shielding his eyes from evil. Others are aware of Prodigy's evil, but they choose to ignore it, rationalizing their compromise as a means to an end. They don't listen to their conscience. Like Arthur, Hermit, and the rest of the search and rescue squad. They may speak up on occasion, but they always end up looking past it, like Kikazuru covering his ears. However, Iwazuru, the monkey who covers his mouth, is the most interesting. He represents the kind of people who witness evil but refuse to speak up, something we see Kirsch has done repeatedly. Unlike the other monkey metaphors, he seems to do so not out of fear, but for leverage.
What's that supposed to mean?
Well, by now, it's pretty clear that Boy and Kirsch have an adversarial relationship. They're passive-aggressive towards each other, and they are constantly trying to flex their superiority over one another.
We should fight one another for the honor of leadership.
Sounds fair.
Now, while Boy's arrogance may convince him that he's the one in control, Kirsch seems to be playing the long game. He's more than willing to stay silent even after witnessing that one of the hybrids has been compromised and is being held digitally hostage. It seems as if he's intentionally letting Yutani get her revenge so that he can take advantage of the power vacuum created by this. Kirsch then hits slightly with a riddle of his own.
If I hurt or caused others to be hurt, would you do something to stop me, or would you look the other way?
And we see that Morrow is watching slightly just as closely as Kirsch has been, and even warns them before answering.
I would stand up for my friends.
Despite the fact that Morrow and Kirsch seem to be on opposing sides of this conflict, their end goals are actually both pretty aligned here. Both of them are pushing slightly to abandon his humanity and embrace his synthetic superiority. We see Kirsch test that here by asking them if they would intervene if somebody were being harmed, and if he would do so of his own free will, just like Morrow did in the last episode.
What would you do in this scenario? Could you harm others or allow them to be harmed?
Now, when Slightly tells him that he would help his friends, which is the more human response, Kirsch's reaction is telling. He pretends to respond positively, but it's not convincing, even for a synthetic, almost as if he's disappointed in Slightly for retaining his empathy. Back in the lab, we get a fresh look at the T. ocelus as it locks eyes with the sheep. Now, the decision to use a sheep for this experiment is an obvious reference to Dolly the sheep, who was the first animal to be cloned. As the T. ocelus finishes his free eye transplant, the sheep stands up on its hind legs, showcasing its intelligence and presenting itself as a terrifying reflection of its captors, which makes us question who's really observing who here. Boy, on the other hand, sees nothing but the weaponizing potential behind this. His insecurity towards Kirsch flares up again as he gets jealous of the creature locking eyes with Kirsch, and then he feels the need to remind it who's the boss after recognizing how smart that it is. We then turn to Arthur and Dame Sylvia, who are trying to cope with the reality that is becoming more apparent in front of them. Even the forest doesn't grant them any privacy, as Prodigy seems to have cameras even hidden in the middle of the woods. Now, when they do finally find a safe place to talk, we can see those different coping mechanisms we discussed earlier finally come into conflict. Arthur sees what Prodigy is doing and is even willing to talk about it with his wife. Still, Dame chooses to recontextualize their actions with Prodigy's narrative. Despite the evidence to the contrary, she sees no evil. Arthur, on the other hand, has chosen to ignore the harmful information even when he sees it. He has chosen to not listen to his better instinct, like Kikazuru, who hears no evil. We see our first revelation of the true nature of the hybrids when Arthur says,
Best case, we got a bunch of AIs running around thinking they're human. Worst case, we killed 6 kids.
and this confirms that the hybrids aren't human, but rather simply AI that have been trained on human brains. They've been trying to convince these kids the entire time that they're still human, but they are not. They aren't human in a biological sense, nor do they possess the personal liberties and autonomy that humans have, which makes Nibs' sudden pregnancy announcement all the more startling.
Yeah, what was that? Can she even get preggo?
She cannot, and the Sylvias clearly know that. Arthur even lets a bit of the truth slip out when he says,
That's impossible, you're a machine.
I'm not a machine.
Now, we don't know for certain why Nibs chose to do this. It's most likely pseudocyesis or a phantom pregnancy. This occurs when someone falsely believes that they are pregnant as a coping mechanism after a traumatic event, like the one that Nibs went through with the T. ocelus. Well, they may not have human emotions, but the fact that they're programmed off of human brains means that they're vulnerable to the same malfunctions that a human brain would have. That said, their synthetic bodies do have the potential to turn childish temper tantrums into something lethal, so the consequences of their mental health problems are much more severe. This shows just how ill-equipped Dame is to actually provide these children with what she was literally hired to do. She then tries to explain to Nibs that for her to have a baby, she's got to engage in the biological activities required to do so.
Like catching the baby after the stork drops it.
Exactly. However, Nibs is well aware of the requirement and tries to argue that her baby was immaculately conceived, like Jesus, without the need for hanky-panky. And this could be hinting that her pseudosciences could be a subliminal attempt at her own salvation, allowing her to escape Prodigy's control, which she's clearly becoming increasingly aware of. Now, when Dr. Sylvia tries to revisit the source of the trauma, it's clear that Nibs is repressing it, further reiterating that training the AI of these hybrids on human brains also makes them vulnerable in ways that they are clearly ill-prepared for. When Dr. Sylvia tries to push further, we see Nibs finally break, leaping across the table and pinning her down. This is the first time we've seen one of the hybrids truly cross this line. In the Alien franchise, it's illegal to program synthetics to harm humans. There are a few exceptions like specific combat androids and specialized security drones like the one Seegson creates in Alien Isolation. However, Ash, who was aboard the Nostromo, was illegally programmed to harm the rest of the crew. Not only was he negligent towards human lives, prioritizing preservation of the specimen, but at one point he even tried to force Ridley to ingest some more literature. However, circumstances like this are incredibly rare and obviously very dangerous, hence why they're illegal. Dr. Sylvia is also well aware of Nibs' capabilities should her tantrum get out of hand, and we see that she's even equipped with an emergency button specifically for this occasion. The fact that she even has this button means that they knew they were dealing with a volatile concept when they created the hybrids, and how Dr. Sylvia's well-intentioned role as mother and counselor was completely fake.
A great big phony!
Her entire office is just another observation lab, no different than the one contained in the other specimens. She seems kind and empathetic to her face, but when confronted with the situation where genuine guidance and therapy are needed, she drops the act. We see this when Nibs takes the doll with her as she's escorted out. The doll itself will likely serve as a reminder of the conversation, even if Prodigy decides to wipe it from her memory. But we see her concern as soon as Nibs leaves the room and she tells the guard to
Tell your supervisor we have a level 3 event. He'll know what to do.
Once again, the hybrids are dehumanized and treated as property, and we finally hear that explicitly stated in the next scene when Joe and Boy's right-hand man, Adam, discuss Hermit's employment situation. He starts by using Hermit as a user test for whether or not Wendy truly feels like his sister, a question that we learned he already knows the answer to, or at least on a legal level. He says,
The difference between $1 trillion business and a blanket with sleeves.
A reference to the Snuggie, which is essentially just a robe turned backwards that people used to buy after being brainwashed by late-night infomercials. Hermit catches onto this pretty quickly and tries to quit, which is when we start to understand the powers at play in this world. Adam explains how Hermit has become entrapped by his new employment, even more so than he was in New Siam. The synthetic faces on the wall behind Adam are positioned in the center of the frame, just like the wise monkeys were previously. The faces show these stark contrasts between those in power and those without it. Unlike the hybrids or the employees, he doesn't have to hide anything, moral or immoral. He has the power and capital to live without the restrictions, unlike Joe. They essentially force him into working for them, not only to pay off his new lung, but by holding his sister hostage, whom he clearly defines as
property of the Prodigy Corporation.
And then finally saying the quiet part out loud when Joe asks,
She is still a human being.
No, she's not.
Like Arthur, Joe continues to listen to his conscience, like Kikazuru, the monkey who hears no evil, as she shakes the whole thing off after meeting with the squad mates shortly after. Then we get a very revealing conversation between Boy and Wendy, which starts with him using his feet to direct where she should sit. This, the fact that we saw him with his feet on the table in the first episode, and the fact that he used his feet to hold up the monitor when talking to Yutani in the second episode, seems to be a subtle hint that this guy's got a thing for feet. Given the sexual undertones of the franchise, this could be a way of subtly showing Boy getting a sense of self-satisfaction out of those that he sees beneath him. Boy's constant use of feet could have a variety of meanings. For instance, it could simply mean that he has a foot fetish, or it could be that he's trying to be quadextrous, somebody who can use his feet and hands, like a monkey. Or it could simply be another way to show off his immaturity. Unlike the last time we saw this room, there's no longer a camera in the corner recording this conversation. Boy then asks Wendy,
When you fought the alien, was it more like fighting pirates or Indians?
which continues to show how his Neverland narrative is something that he's not only building on the fly, but it's also quickly falling apart, just like Nibs did in episode 2 when she was pointing out its plot holes in Maginot's lab. He's trying to fit reality into a metaphor rather than the other way around. He finally lands on the alien being a crocodile, which is actually a pretty apt metaphor for the xenomorph. In Peter Pan, the croc serves as a natural consequence for Captain Hook's actions, just like the xenomorph who exists as a consequence of unchecked capitalistic hubris. He finishes with,
And now you can hear the clock.
which also fits unfortunately well, given that the clock was a warning sign of the crocodile approaching. However, as we see by the end of the episode, the ticking she's hearing may not in fact be a warning, but a calling. Boy questioning her like this and helping him form the narrative seems to indicate that he sees her as somewhat of an equal, at least for a moment. But as soon as Wendy shows her empathy and argues against Boy's experiments because of the pain it causes them, he replies with how the specimen's very nature is to destroy.
Popped out my eyeball and burrowed into my brain. I mean, they would if they could, so why not just cut them open?
The question itself feels like a callback to the first moment we met Maisie and her conversation with Kirsch about whether or not to kill the scorpion, showing how Boy clearly lacks the empathy that Wendy has had from the very beginning. Boy then shifts the power dynamic as he starts to debate whether or not Joe should get the chance to stay on the island. Boy is clearly not a family man, even going so far as saying,
It's nice if you like brothers, which I don't. Or fathers, or mothers, always telling us what to do.
This not only feels like a direct nod to his Peter Pan complex, but it also seems to further validate the idea that he's the one who was responsible for his family's death, as we saw outlined in the article last episode. We see Boy use this as an opportunity to push Wendy emotionally and intellectually. He's already made arrangements for Joe to stay, but he wants to see if Wendy can make an argument for it that impresses him. Yet again, he is pushing Wendy into becoming his egotistical ideal of a super intelligent synthetic prodigy, pun intended. He desperately wants Wendy to be able to challenge him on an intellectual level, but he's still insecure enough that he has to reinforce control over her so that she doesn't get too smart with her ideas. We can also tell that Boy has been watching the conversations between Joe and Wendy, including the conversation they had earlier when Wendy hinted that she might resent Joe for not showing up at the hospital when she was sick, and then he uses that against her. He's trying to drive a wedge between the siblings so that he can remain the most critical person in Wendy's life. They finally agree to a devil's bargain, where Wendy commits to helping Boy understand what the Xenos are saying, and Joe gets to stay. This continues to show just how little freedom and autonomy the hybrids have, despite their constant attempts to achieve this, just like we see in the next scene with Kirsch and Toodles, who decides to give himself a new name. He chooses Isaac after Isaac Newton, just like Isaac, the sentient robot Kalon emissary from the show The Orville. The name is also yet another reference to Isaac Asimov's law of robotics, which are the laws we see used in iRobot to keep the robots from killing people, much like the legal restrictions that we see on synthetics in this series. Oddly enough, Kirsch endorses Isaac's attempted independence when he tells him that the name suits him. We see yet again how the hybrid's immaturity continues to be its most significant vulnerability when Slightly can't even come up with a convincing lie to sneak himself into the lab. Now, when he breaks the news tomorrow, we start to see the cyborg's plan come together. After Slightly giving him his real name, he was able to track down his mother and hold her hostage, which became a much more convincing motivation than his moral argument from earlier. He is essentially the Captain Hook of this Peter Pan metaphor, which is something many of you mentioned in the comments of our last breakdown video. It's not only fitting, given that he has a pretty fancy hook hand, but the pirate motif also fits in perfectly, since he's a rogue agent operating outside of the bounds of capitalism, and he's willing to do anything necessary to achieve his ends. And yet again, we see Kirsch observing this, but continuing to keep it to himself, even as Morrow escalates the situation, just like Iwazuru, the wise monkey who speaks no evil. Morrow then assigns Slightly a new task, to get someone into the lab and use them as a host for a fresh new xenomorph. And we see Slightly get some ideas as to who that could be in the very next scene. Here we see the Lost Boys playing in a rare moment where they can actually be kids. They trick Joe into trying one of their flavor chips, which seem to be based on floppy disks. Now, these were flexible, removable magnetic disks that computers used to store information in the 80s and 90s, which again leans into the retro-futuristic look that Hawley intends for this series. In the background, we see Isaac and Curly playing a game of Jenga with giant concrete blocks, since their super strength allows them to do so. Curly asked Joe about the 5, which was teased in the computer articles last episode. Now, these of course are the 5 corporations that own the world: Weyland-Yutani, Prodigy, Dynamic, Lynch, and Threshold. But what's interesting is how Joe prefaces the introduction, saying,
"The old planet had something called governments, where people they would vote for who they wanted making decisions, right? It didn't work.
The fact that they see the very idea of government as a failure just goes to show how far the people of Earth have surrendered their personal freedoms to these corporations. We hear Isaac talk about how much he's learned from the life forms, and Curly responds with,
If you love them so much, why didn't you just marry them?
which is a line borrowed from the late great Paul Reubens' Pee Wee Herman, who used that gag as a running joke ever since the Pajama Party episode of Pee Wee's Playhouse.
I love fruit salad!
Then why don't you marry it?
Slightly crashes the party and gets rightfully upset when he sees that Joe is still on the island safe and sound. He's obviously projecting his own fears given the current situation with Morrow, but can you blame him? He's not wrong. However, even after Joe agrees with him, we see that the real holdouts, Isaac and Curly, are much more hesitant to do anything that rocks the boat. Then we're taken to several shots feeding into one another, showing Wendy observing the xenofetus in Joe's former lung and trying to communicate with it alongside slightly stalking Joe outside of his room, calling back to the title of the episode, Observation. Just before the chestburster erupts from the tank, we hear Wendy singing to it, almost like a lullaby. This could be a reference to Ripley singing You Are My Lucky Star in the original Alien movie, and like Morrow did in episode 1, both of which use the melody to calm themselves down in tense situations. However, here we see Wendy use it to comfort the Xeno, like she's singing to her child. Now this maternal attachment to the xenomorph is straight out of Alien Resurrection, where Ripley 8 became a human hybrid Xeno Queen through a botched cloning attempt. When the chestburster finally does make its appearance, it's much clearer than any chestburst we've ever seen before, almost darker in color, likely due to the fact that it was incubated in the tank's clear fluid rather than a human chest, and it shoots out much further too for the same reason. As the episode closes out, it's hard to confirm that Wendy's maternal connection goes far beyond the sounds that she can make, as the chestburster begins acting like a charmed snake without her even making a peep. As the credits roll, we hear Oceanside by Jane's Addiction, which is a song about being homeless, a significant contrast to the song we heard last episode. The lyrics are about a homeless man who wishes that he could be the size of the ocean so that no one could move him, and that he could finally have a home. The last episode ended with Metallica's Wherever I May Roam, which is about finding a home wherever you are, while Oceanside argues that you never have a home unless you are unmovable, or rather, exist beyond the capacity of the ruling class. The contrast between the two songs show how the hybrid's realities have been redefined by the observations that they've made in this episode. Neverland is not their home, it is their prison, a somber but fitting note to leave us on. And guys, that's everything that we caught for episode 4. What are your thoughts on the series so far? Are there any details we missed? We know there are, just tell us. You can let me know down in the comments or at me on Twitter at Ryan Airy, or you can yell at Dodson Sides who wrote this video. You can find his social links below. And of course, hey look, if it's your first time here, I just gotta say welcome to the channel. This is great. We really enjoy talking to you. Subscribe, smash buttons for ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy.